This is a launch of not only our Interfaith initiative at McMurry University, but also a continuation of our internationalization project. We started this a couple of years ago because we do think that in order to be an educated person, you do need to have some kind of sense of the international, the global world. And so as I was thinking about the keynote speaker, I thought that Eboo Patel, who was a member of President Barack Obama's inaugural advisory council on faith-based neighborhood partnerships, would be an ideal person to really kick us off. Patel grew up in Glen Ellen, Illinois, and earned an undergraduate degree in sociology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. After graduating from college, Patel felt that diversity, service, and faith were important parts of civic life, but found no community organization that touched on all three, specifically one that worked with young people. Because of this vacuum, he developed the idea for the Interfaith Youth Corps, a Chicago-based international nonprofit that aims to promote interfaith cooperation. Now, Patel's first book, Acts of Faith, was published in 2007 and details how he became interested in religious diversity. Patel and IFYC partnered with White House officials in developing President Obama's Interfaith and Community Service Campus Challenge, which invited schools across the nation to make interfaith cooperation a campus priority, and launched it in 2011. His second book, Sacred Ground, Pluralism, Prejudice, and the Promise of America, was released in August 2012. In 2015, I was fortunate enough to be invited to the 5th Annual White House Convening on Interfaith, which focused on religion in 21st century America, and I heard Dr. Patel speak at Howard University on the concept of interfaith. This meeting was sponsored by the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, the U.S. Department of Education, the Corporation for National and Community Service, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the U.S. Department of State. And I was struck at the time that some of the efforts were really talking about how interfaith could improve our national security issues. Our previous chaplain, Reverend Jeff Lust, also attended, and we both got excited about launching a similar initiative at McMurry and welcomed representatives from the Interfaith Youth Corps on our campus last year to participate in strategic planning sessions about the concept. And we've had at least 4 groups of students attend leadership conferences about this topic. Since that time, I've heard Dr. Patel speak 2 other times, once at the National Association of Schools and Colleges of the United Methodist Church College Presidents Meeting, and again at the Methodist Denominational Gathering at Oklahoma City University, where we also had a large student contingent attend. Each time I've been impressed by Dr. Patel, his insights, and I've always learned a lot. We so appreciate also the generosity of the Texas Methodist Foundation, which has funded a grant to McMurry to help build our interfaith effort, and as a part of that effort, we were able to invite Dr. Patel to our campus to visit a number of groups on our campus in this 2-day period as we launch this signature initiative. We appreciate the TMF president, Tom Locke, and his wife, Cindy, joining us this evening, and also former McMurry trustee and TMF board member, Bynum Myers, who is here as well. Dr. Eboo Patel is an Ashoka Fellow, which is a select network of social entrepreneurs whose stated mission is to shape a global, entrepreneurial, competitive citizen sector, one that allows social entrepreneurs to thrive and enables the world's citizens to think and act as change makers. Dr. Patel has spoken at the TED Conference, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, and now McMurry University. Please help me welcome Dr. Eboo Patel.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm going to begin with the most beautiful words in the English language. Let me tell you a story. It's a story about a friend of mine who is a remarkable interfaith leader who I've come to know the past 5 or 6 years. He's a Texan. He leads a church in Keller, Texas. His name is Reverend Bob Roberts. Anybody know Reverend Roberts? All right. So one of the things I love to ask artists, leaders, intellectuals I admire is, how did you come to be who you are? So I asked Bob, how'd you come to be who you are? And he said, it started with this tension between fear and love. It started in East Texas. He probably lives driving distance from here, or grew up driving distance from here. And he said, I was raised in deep faith and deep love, with the exception of 2 groups of people. One group was Catholics. At my daddy's church, he said, we had people get up in the pulpit and they would preach love and love and love. And then it would come to Catholics, and it would be like the person changed before my eyes. And they would spit ugly fire, and they would call people names. And I grew up in that, and I absorbed it. Second group of people that I grew up hating, the Vietnamese folks. It's the 1960s, and I saw the kids who used to buy us Cokes at the local drugstore and ice creams go off to this foreign land called Vietnam and come back broken, if they came back at all. He says, I remember one day my daddy goes to do a visit to a family who lost their son in Vietnam, and I sat outside in the car and I could hear the wailing of the families on the inside. I grew up with love, except for these 2 groups. I followed my daddy's footsteps. I became a pastor. And it turns out that one of my congregants was an American soldier in the Vietnam War. And he would tell me that he would continually go back to Vietnam. And I said, this is Reverend Roberts talking, said, are you still processing your hatred and fear? And he's like, no, I'm an amateur pilot, and I'm running relief supplies from the cities up into remote villages in the mountains. I love Vietnamese people. And Bob said, but where I grew up and what I saw and what people told me, and the guy's like, Bob, God is not fear. God is love. God is not fear. God is love. Come with me to Vietnam. So Bob goes with this congregant of his, this lay person who's leading him to Vietnam, and he's vibrating. This is him explaining this. He's vibrating with fear. And every Vietnamese person he meets, he likes more than the last one he meets. It's like, these are the kindest and gentlest people I can imagine. I want to start a school here to help these people. And his congregant friend was like, that Christian group over there started a school. You should go over there and ask them how they did it. So Bob goes up and he winds up knocking on the doors of a Catholic school. Bob goes to remote villages. He thinks to himself, I really want to start a healthcare center here. And his friend's like, well, you should ask that group of people. They did it 20 years ago. Bob winds up knocking on the door of the St. Jude Catholic Healthcare Center. Everywhere Bob turns, every project he has imagined, it appears that the Catholics have gotten there first. What Bob finally winds up doing is starting international youth exchanges with the government of Vietnam in cooperation with this set of Catholic education and relief agencies. Bob had 120 Vietnamese exchange students live in his house. At like 8:30 at night, I'm kicking the dinner guests out. I like my space, right? Bob, he's just open-hearted like that. 9/11 rolls around. And on the TV, not only is there this terrible incident that's happened, but the whispers have started. This looks like something the Muslims would do. Bob doesn't know any Muslims. he's happy about that. He's at his breakfast table. He's drinking his coffee. He closes his eyes and he says a prayer. Dear God, keep America safe. Keep my family safe. Thank you so much for never putting me in contact with any crazy Muslims. He opens his eyes, and there's his Vietnamese exchange student sitting at the breakfast table. And he has this mantra in his head. God is love, not fear. And he thinks to himself, had it not been for that congregant who 10, 15 years back had said that to him and brought him to Vietnam, that kid, this gentle, sweet Vietnamese kid, wouldn't be sitting at that breakfast table. 10, 15 years ago, Bob hated that kid. Never even met him. Bob feared that kid. Never even met him. Bob has this spiritual flash. Could there be an Ahmed in Egypt who I could like? An Abdul in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, who I could like? Is this a little bit like the situation with Vietnamese folks and Catholics? There is this fear and hatred that's been built up in me that if I had contact, if I was in a space to cooperate, it could look different. God is love, not fear. Bob is kind of an all or nothing kind of guy. Bob is not the kind of guy who, upon deciding that he wants to have contact with Muslims, goes to the mosque around the corner or asks questions of his doctor or doctor friends who might be Muslim. Bob doesn't even decide that his first trip is going to be to, say, cosmopolitan Turkey or Malaysia. Bob grows a foot-long beard and heads to Afghanistan. True story. If you're going to do it, you might as well do it, right? Y'all can laugh. These are kind of jokes. The point is that Bob decides, if I have a fear in my heart without knowledge, it's my fault, not theirs. It's my problem and I got to solve it, right? For the last 10 years, Bob has made cooperation with Muslims his thing. He's been traveling the world with a guy named Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, who is the sheikh of probably the most prominent Muslim preacher in America, a guy named Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. That's his sheikh. Sheikh is an honorific term for a learned person. It's a little bit like rabbi in Islam. He's been traveling the world with this guy, talking about the similarities between evangelical Christianity and an orthodox understanding of Islam. He takes groups of rabbis, pastors, and imams all over the Muslim majority world. He hosts in Keller, Texas, something called the Global Faith Forum, which brings people from all different backgrounds together in this giant interfaith conference. I was there a couple years ago. Prince Turki Al Faisal, who's part of the Saudi royal family, was one of the speakers. I'm like, Bob, why all in like this? And he's like, man, God is love, not fear. God is love, not fear. I love that story, right? Because it's honest about where some of us begin. Certainly, I was raised with my fair share of prejudices. Certainly, it took me time to unwind that tape in my head and to replace it with a new tape. What's the cost of fear beating love? There's this great Cherokee story that some of you might have heard. A grandfather tells his grandson that within each of us, there's two wolves. There's the wolf of love, of kindness, of generosity, of gentleness. There's the wolf of fear, of hatred, of prejudice. And the grandson asks the grandfather, which one grows? The grandfather says, the one you feed. For me, that's a profound story, right? And it's not surprising to me it comes from the wisdom of indigenous people, right? Which wolf within us, knowing we have the capacity for both, are we feeding? And what is the cost of feeding the wolf of fear? I have a friend named Idris Goodwin. He's a playwright and a filmmaker, great guy, great artist. And about 15 years ago, he had a chance to make a film that involved going to Jordan. Some of the shooting was going to be done in Jordan. A couple weeks before leaving, he had his flight. He'd made all his arrangements. In fact, I'd helped him make some of these arrangements because I was involved in the project. He says to me, I'm not going. I'm like, what happened? He's like, I don't want to end up like the dude on the video. It's a time when a video of a terrible Muslim extremist incident which involved the murder of a Westerner was making the rounds on the internet. And Idris had seen the video or heard news reports of it. It was like, I don't want to go. I'm like, Idris, do you know anything else about Jordan other than that video? He's like, no. I'm like, go to Jordan, Idris. Right? That country cannot be reduced to that video. Idris goes to Jordan, and he's shooting his film, but he feels like this kind of sense of dis-ease. He walks down the street. There are folks who, he gets the sense that they like see him and they cross the street. He goes into a restaurant, and there's people sitting at the table next to him, and somebody gets up and goes to the bathroom, and the next thing Idris knows, the whole table has moved 2 tables over. And Idris asks a friend of his in Jordan, who's helped set this project up, am I imagining this? Like, I feel like people are like moving away from me. And his friend is like, Idris, you're black, and we've seen videos. I just want you to think about that for a second. Idris, this great African-American playwright and filmmaker, right? He's a tenured professor now. Didn't want to go to Jordan because of this video. What he knew about Jordan was this crazy video, right? That didn't mean it didn't happen. It happened. It existed. Was it all 6 million people who live in Jordan? Of course not. He finally goes. And what happens to him? People are afraid of him because of the videos they've seen of people who look like him. Are we going to base how we feel about and relate to other people based on videos like that? Is that the world we're going to live in? Let me tell you a story about a kid grew up not far from here. A kid named Ahmed Muhammad. Grew up in Irving, Texas. Kid liked science. Was good at it. A couple years ago, he makes out of a pencil case a clock, a cool clock. He's got a favorite teacher at school who he thinks will appreciate this clock. Brings the clock to school. Tick, tick, tick. Teacher calls the authorities. You think that would have happened if his name was Steve Smith? You think the name Ahmed Muhammad played no role in that? So let me ask you something. Do we want in America 14-year-old kids who know how to make clocks out of pencil cases? I do. I don't care if your name is Ahmed Muhammad or Steve Smith or Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. I want you here. I want you in a nation known for growing entrepreneurs. I want you building companies. I want you contributing. What is the price of our prejudice, of that fear? I think part of the price is that it's a violation of the American tradition. It's a violation of the nature of this nation. Michael Walzer, in a great book called What It Means to Be an American, points out that for generations, centuries really, political philosophers believed that if you wanted diversity, you had to have an empire. You had to have a dictator. For democracy, you needed homogeneity. How would, these political philosophers thought, how would one ethnic or religious or racial group ever accept a ruler from a different ethnic, religious, or racial group? It's never going to happen. It's against human nature. For diversity, you need dictatorships. For democracy, it needs to be like 5th century Athens. Everybody looks the same, at least everybody who has voting and citizen rights in the republic or in the city-state. Walzer ends that section and begins the next one with these words, until the United States of America. This is the first nation that believed you could have a religiously diverse democracy. That's a stunning fact of human history. Our founders were the first people who set up a nation with the notion that people from the 4 corners of the earth, speaking in different languages, praying to God in different ways, including not praying to God at all, could come to a single patch of earth and build out of it a formal country. That's the American idea. So, when in the Continental Army, a group of anti-Catholic soldiers burned the Pope in effigy, George Washington sent a stern rebuke, something along the lines of, I can think of no more foolish and insulting activity when we are attempting an alliance with French Catholic Canada and you have Catholic soldiers from Maryland to be insulting the religion of your compatriots. This is George Washington. When he is president, he receives a letter from a man named Moses Sessions, the head of the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. Note, there are Jews in America in the 18th century. Moses Sessions says, congratulations, President Washington, on your title, on your election, on the new nation. I have a query for you. What will happen to we Jews in this newly constituted United States of America? Think what has happened to us in Europe, hated and hounded and harassed for hundreds of years. What will be our fate here? George Washington writes back in what I believe is one of the great documents in American history, the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. He says, all have a like liberty of conscience. This government will give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham sit under their vine and fig in safety. Let there be none to make them afraid. The last line of that letter is the epigraph of my second book, Sacred Ground. Washington writes, may the Lord of all mercies scatter light and not darkness, make us useful in our individual vocations and happy in his everlasting way. The Muslims in the audience will recognize Islamic references, whether Washington intended them or not. May the Lord of all mercies, we Muslims, the most common prayer we say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the all-merciful, the ever-merciful. May the Lord of all mercies scatter light and not darkness. How is God described in the Quran? As a lamp within a niche, as light upon light. I feel a particular connection to that phrase of George Washington, especially as an American Muslim, knowing that that is the creed upon which this nation is founded. And it is not just Washington. Benjamin Franklin made donations to the building funds of every religious community in Philadelphia, including the Jewish synagogue, required as a condition of these donations that during his funeral, the clergy of all of these religious communities would attend the funeral together. Required cooperation. Built a hall in Philadelphia, said the pulpit of this hall would be open to the persuasion and speech of any preacher. Should the Grand Mufti of Constantinople send a preacher speaking Islam, this pulpit is at his service. This is Benjamin Franklin, late 18th century. James Madison talked about how the multiplicity of sects, of religious communities, is a protection for America. The notion being, he gets this through Voltaire, that if you have one religious community, it will do what one religious community always does. It will seek to dominate the rest. If you have two religious communities, they will do what two religious communities typically do, which is that they will be at each other's throats. But in America, as Madison pointed out, we have 30 religious communities. He meant mostly Protestant denominations, but back then, let us not underestimate the difference between Baptists, Presbyterians, etc. We have 30 of them, he said. They're going to have to learn how to get along. They're going to have to learn how to protect one another. And as I read that, I could not help but think about Islam. I could not help but think about the story in Islam where the Prophet Muhammad, before he actually reaches prophethood, before his 40th birthday in the moment of revelation, he is still a highly respected figure in the city of Mecca. He is known as Al-Amin, the reliable. There is an argument between different clans in Mecca over who will have the honor of placing the last stone within the Kaaba. Al-Amin, the merchant Muhammad, comes walking into the town square. And these clans, these different members, these different clans, they say, he will tell us how we resolve this dispute. What Muhammad does is he has this black stone, the holy stone of the Kaaba. We Muslims believe it is the house of God built by Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael. The black stone would be placed in the center of the blanket, and each of the members of these diverse tribes would gather around the blanket. Each would hold a piece, bring it to the Kaaba cooperatively, and Muhammad himself would push it in its final inches. Cooperation, central to the tradition. The date from which the Islamic calendar is dated is not the year of the Prophet's birth, 570, is not the year of Revelation, 610, it's the year of the Hijrah, the year where the Prophet Muhammad makes the journey from Mecca to Medina. What does he do when he is in Medina? He creates the Constitution of Medina. It is a pact between the different religious communities and tribes of that city, which guarantees each one freedom and individuality in their own identity and creates a pact of mutual defense. I can't help but think of James Madison when I think of the Constitution of Medina. It is the diversity of American religious communities that will protect this nation. So you see where I am going with this. I'm going in the direction of theology. It is for Bob Roberts, who I started with, for him it's the cornerstone. God is love and not fear. That's why I went to Vietnam. That's why I partnered with Catholics. That's why I grew my beard and went to Afghanistan. That's why I travel the world with Sheikh bin Baya. That's why I hold the global forum. Because God is love and not fear. Ultimately, interfaith cooperation emerges out of our religious traditions. We don't do interfaith cooperation in spite of being Methodist or Muslim. We do it because we are Methodist or Muslim. In fact, I think it is a requirement of different religious traditions. I am now going to do something extremely dangerous. I'm going to exegete the Bible in Abilene, Texas. You will help me if I need help, will you not? Politely. So, in the city of Chicago, believe it or not, they let me teach in seminary every once in a while. I know, crazy northerners, right? But I've taught in about a half dozen seminaries, and I always ask my students at the beginning of class, what's your favorite Bible story? And at least half of them say it's the Good Samaritan story. And I ask them why, and they say it's because it's a message about embracing the other. And I probably heard this 50 times, right? Nobody ever said much more than embracing the other. But I had this sense of, Jesus doesn't say in the Bible, embrace the random other. The other has a specific identity, the identity Samaritan. So I asked my friend Nick Price, who's a Missouri Synod Lutheran pastor in the suburbs of Chicago, near where I grew up, actually. I said, tell me about these Samaritans. And Nick walks with me through the Good Samaritan story, right, line by line. The story starts, lawyer says to Jesus, how do I attain eternal life? Small question, right? How do I attain eternal life? Jesus says, you know the answer to that question. Love God and your neighbor. Lawyer has a follow-up. My wife is a lawyer. I can see how this happens. Who is my neighbor? In response, Jesus, who we Muslims know as Prophet Isa, tells a story. It's a story of a man left by the side of the road that runs from Jerusalem to Jericho. He's been robbed, left for dead. Two people pass him by, priest, Levite, leaders of his own religious community. Somebody stops, cleans his wounds, bathes them in oil and wine, puts this man on his donkey, brings this man to an inn, stays with him through the night, nurses him back to some semblance of health, gives the innkeeper 2 days' wages, says, keep this man, help him come back to full health. If you need more money, if he needs to stay longer, I'll come back and pay you the difference. Who was this man? He's a Samaritan, right? It's the Good Samaritan. Jesus ends the story by saying, go and do likewise. So Nick is leading me through this. Then he flips in the Bible to a different Bible story. It's the story of the woman at the well. We start going through that story. Jesus meets a Samaritan woman at the well. They begin to talk. Jesus points out that she prays at a different temple. Says, you pray to a God you do not know. I look at Nick and I'm like, Jesus is arguing with this woman. He's like, yeah. And I'm like, this is a theological argument. This isn't you like the wrong kind of ice cream. This is you pray to a God you do not know. That's a theological statement. You pray to the wrong temple. That's a doctrinal dispute. And Nick is like, yeah. And I'm like, the Samaritans were not just random others. The Samaritans were religious others. The Samaritans were people with a different doctrine. And Nick is like, yeah. And I'm like, so let me get this straight. Here is a story that begins with the not insignificant question, how do I attain eternal life? Jesus basically says, in this particular ethical instance, don't follow the way of your own religious leaders. This person whom you disagree with doctrinally, who stops, bathes the wounds, nurses back to health, go and do likewise. Yeah, I know, different religion. Go and do likewise. You asked me how we attain eternal life? Here is somebody with a different religion and superior ethics. I've told you the story. Go and do likewise. You tell me a command of interfaith cooperation is not at the heart of the Christian tradition. It is in Islam as well. Every year of his adult life, this merchant named Muhammad Al-Amin he would make this pilgrimage to Mount Hira outside of the city of Mecca. He would go up to this cave. He would fast. He would pray. He would give alms to the poor. One night, we Muslims believe it's one of the odd nights of the last 10 days of the holy month of Ramadan. We don't know exactly which night. I love the mystery of that. I love the mystery of it. This man feels this enveloping force, and he hears this voice say, "Ikra," recite. And Muhammad says, "I am not a reciter." Second time, the force squeezes him even harder. "Recite." Muhammad says, "I am not a reciter." Third time, he feels like the life is being squeezed out of him. And this time, the first words of the Quran, "Recite in the name of your Lord who created humankind from a clot of blood," comes pouring out of his mouth. There are sources that say he was petrified. He thought that he might have been possessed by a jinn, demon-like creatures we Muslims believe in, who existed in the Hejaz and the western half of the Arabian Peninsula. Goes back to the person he trusts and respects most in the world, his wife. Never let anybody tell you Islam is misogynist at its core. Doesn't mean it's not misogynist in some of its expressions, but the person that Rasulullah, the messenger of God, loved and respected most, a woman, his wife, goes and asks her advice. "What has happened to me? I'm scared." His wife says, "I don't know what's happened, but I do know this, that God would not allow a man as righteous as you to be possessed. Something special has taken place. We will go and ask my uncle Waraka. Waraka will know. Waraka is learned in the scriptures." Khadija takes her husband, trembling, to Waraka, this man. I have this image of this old man, long beard, deep-set eyes. And he looks at Muhammad and he kisses him on the forehead. And he says, "Verily, the prophet of your people has arrived." Who is Waraka? What does it mean to be learned in the scriptures in the early 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula? Waraka is a Christian. He's a Christian monk. The first person to recognize the prophethood of Muhammad is a Christian monk. The sources suggest Waraka never converts to Islam. The prophet actually doesn't seek his conversion. He only respectfully watches as this new religious civilization emerges in his midst. This is not the only story of how deep love and respect for the Christian tradition is also at the heart of Islam. Here is another one. Early in the Prophet's mission, which I believe boils down to something very simple. It's mercy and monotheism. Islam is about two things, mercy and monotheism. Love God, do mercy. It's that simple. And as he preaches this, there are certain tribes and clans in Mecca who he's threatening. He's threatening their business. He's threatening their tensions and disputes, their tribal alliances. There are death threats out against Muhammad and the early companions. So the Prophet, wanting to make sure that Islam is safe if all of the early Muslims should be wiped out, he sends a contingent led by one of his relatives to a place called Abyssinia. He believes that they'll be safe in Abyssinia. Abyssinia is present-day Ethiopia. Why does he believe they'll be safe in Abyssinia? Because the king of Abyssinia is a man known as the Negus. The Negus is Christian. And Muhammad believes that Muslims are likely to be safer under a Christian king than in his own homeland of Mecca. So a couple of the people at war with Muhammad in Mecca, they go down to Abyssinia to make mischief. They whisper in the ear of the Negus, you know that you have foreigners in your land. So the Negus finally feels required to kind of call these people forth and ask them some questions. Brings them to his court. I have this image of the Negus on this grand throne, his bishops surrounding him, this staff in his hand, and he demands that they explain their religion. In response, Ja'far of the house of the prophet recites to the Negus and his bishops the verses of the Quran that speak of the holiness of Mary. The Negus is so moved by this. The sources say his tears flowed so copiously that they wet his beard. His bishops' tears flowed so copiously. All their beards are wet. So moved were they by these verses that spoke of the holiness of this shared figure, Mary. The Negus stands and draws a line with his staff in the sand and says, the difference between your religion and mine is no thicker than this line in the sand. You will always be safe here. It was not just Christians respecting Muslims back then. Some years later, when the prophet is in Medina, a group of Christians from a place called Najran come and visit. They have a theological argument. There are differences between Christianity and Islam. When people who go to their first Interfaith conference come to me and they're like, but those people have a different idea of God than I do. I'm like, what did you think you were going to? Right? There are differences between different religions. It is okay to discuss, even argue these differences. The prophet himself did it in the city of Medina. When it came time for the Christians of Najran to pray, they asked the prophet if they could have leave of the city so they could go out to the outskirts, offer their prayers, come back and resume the theological argument. The prophet says, no, pray in my mosque. And the Christians of Najran said, but we're arguing doctrine. We'll go outside. We'll respect your space. And the prophet said, you respect my space by offering your prayers in my mosque. Of course we have theological differences. This doesn't mean I do not love and respect your tradition. This doesn't mean I won't offer you hospitality. There is a theology of interfaith cooperation in all of our religions. What an opportunity we have in 21st century America, right? What an opportunity. What an opportunity you have at McMurry University. You have an opportunity to live in to the American vision. George Washington, James Madison, the Flushing Remonstrance, Roger Williams, you have an opportunity to live that out. Give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. All have a like liberty of conscience. You can build that at this cool little school of 1,000 students, right? In this cool little city of 100,000 that unbelievably has its own interfaith council. What a great opportunity. We have an opportunity to go more deeply in the theologies of our own religions. I think to myself sometimes that of course there are complications by being surrounded by people of other traditions. Of course there are complications explaining how you adhere to one doctrine, disagreeing with another while still respecting the doctrine and cooperating with the person. Of course that's challenging. But I think to myself, I would never be able to live out the fullness of Islam, the fullness of the story of the Christians of Najran, the story of Abyssinia, the ethic of Waraka, if I didn't have diversity around me. How would I know the full meaning of when the Quran says we were made different nations and tribes that we may come to know one another unless I was surrounded by diversity? What an unbelievable, beautiful gift. But the wolf of love has to win, right? We have to stop feeding the wolf of fear. This notion of God being love or mercy and not fear, that has to win, right? Bob Roberts, enveloped by love, growing up in East Texas, except for Catholics, except for Vietnamese. I mean, mad respect for a guy who was like, you know what? It doesn't count if you have exceptions. You don't get to say God is love except for these people and those people. What an opportunity we have if we take it. I'll leave you with the lines of another great Native American poet, William Stafford, from a ritual to read to each other. If you don't take the time to get to know me, and I don't take the time to get to know you, then a pattern that others made may prevail in this world. And following the wrong God home, we could miss our star. Those who are awake must be awake now, or else a falling line may lull us back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, must be clear now, because the darkness around us is deep. Jazakallah khair. May God give you goodness. Thank you. I think we have time for questions. Boy, you all are a somber audience. Was it something I said? All right, we probably have 10 minutes or so for questions. We'll start here. Yeah. Did you set that up? That was a good opening question. Is that your sister? I think a couple things, right? Number one, so this is a very special place. This is a very special place, right? It's a place that, my colleagues and staff, Joe, Megan have been here before. I've known Mark, I've known others from here for some years now. Tom Locke, my friend of the Texas Methodist Foundation, has told me about McMurry. When we host conferences in Dallas and Oklahoma City, these are the folks who come a day early, right, with bells on. How cool is it that 1,000 student college in Abilene, Texas is a Saudi Students Association? Just how cool is that, right? What an unbelievable global education everybody's getting here. I just think that's the most special thing, right? So that is a precious jewel. Just remember that. You have a precious jewel. 2, expect friction. There's going to be some friction. Expect friction, right? It's kind of like the mountain climber gets to the mountain. She's not like, what the hell are you doing there, right? She expected the mountain. That's what she trained for, right? Just expect some. If you are leading, if you're creating change, expect some friction. It's just going to happen. 3, do one's best to not demonize all people giving friction. It's one of the reasons I started with the Bob Roberts story. I mean, I don't know if there's anybody in interfaith in the world of interfaith cooperation who I admire more. There's probably people I admire equally, but Bob is like, top 10, right? He runs an evangelical church in Keller, Texas. Do you think everybody loves this? He's traveling around the world with like dudes who look like they're out of the 11th century, giving talks about evangelical Christianity and Islam. Not everybody likes it, right? He's like, look, I had to get over my fear. I'm just glad that people were gentle with me. I'm just glad I had that congregant in my church. It's like, Bob, you got to come with me, man, right? There's a great line by the English poet Edward Markham. You drew a line that drew me out, heretic rebel, a thing to flout, but love and I had the wit to win. We drew a line that drew you in. You can't do that with everybody, and it doesn't work every time. But it is better to address fire with water than fire with fire, right? So what does it look like to just be like, look, I am going to speak in a way that brings you into the tent, even if you're not sure you want to be in it right now, right? And the reason that I don't see this stopping is because you just cannot be an educated person in the 21st century and carry deep prejudices against significant swaths of humankind. You just can't call yourself educated. You cannot be how are you going to be a decent nurse or teacher or social worker or business person if you hate a quarter of your clients or students from the get-go? You can't do it, right? So this is a special place because it's on the vanguard of that. At some point, everybody's going to wake up and figure out, as Robert Putnam says at the opening to his paper, E Pluribus Unum, the one certain thing we can say about every society is that it is going to be more diverse in the future than it is today. That is certain, right? So if colleges are not on the vanguard, modeling in a micro-civil society, a beloved, diverse community, preparing young people to be educated 21st century citizens, nurturing competent professionals who are able to engage as nurses, teachers, social workers, business people, police officers, et cetera, in highly diverse settings. Who's going to do it if not college campuses? And now they have a lead to follow. Yes, Tom.
Give you a response as the funder for this as to why we think that this is important and why we're doing this on other campuses around beyond McMurry. But McMurray is one of those that has taken the absolute lead in this, and that is something that I hope we take a lot of pride in. And that is that Jesus talks about our loving one another, loving our neighbor. Not just some of them, love our neighbor. This, in our mind, is about helping this campus community have additional tools that are helpful in helping us be able to love our neighbor. And that's why we are interested.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I grew up in a Jewish household in a place not too far from Keller, Texas, about 30 minutes southwest, a town called Whitestone, Texas. Where I grew up, it's not exactly the friendliest place for a minority of any kind to express themselves or go talk to people with differing beliefs. It's not safe, it's not kind. I guess my question to you is, how do we talk to those people with kindness and love and respect when they won't listen to us talking to them with those?
Yeah. So, I think, first of all, that's a terrific question. Thank you. It's a very challenging question, right? So I'm going to answer abstractly at first, and then I'm going to answer more particularly. Political philosophers like to talk about the circle of civil discourse, right? And the circle of civil discourse is wide, right? So there's free speech in the United States within legal limits, which is to say that you can basically say about anything outside of fire in a crowded theater unless there's a fire, right? In which case, please shout fire. You can't engage in perjury or libel, but you can say anything else legally. The circle of civil discourse is narrower than legal limits. There's people who I don't personally want to talk to who have the right to say what they want to say. I don't really want to talk to them. But in my mind, the circle of civil discourse is wide. And I want to basically talk to you. I would say I am not buying a cookie from the KKK bake sale. But outside of that, I'm interested in talking. Really, I really am, right? I'm not I'll tell you if you're offending me, but I'm interested in talking. And actually, I feel like it is a skill that I would like to continue to develop and improve the skill of talking to people with whom I disagree, who have very different life experiences and very different views than me. Okay, so that's story number one, right? That's the abstraction. Here's the particularity. You have a lot more experience in white settlement Texas than I do, right? And I have, at this point, just been in too many places in America, and I've had too many positive experiences to be entirely dismissive a priori, without knowledge, right? I am driving. I've been now to 5 Texas campuses. This is your fault, Tom. I've been to 5 Texas campuses within about 90 minutes from Dallas in the last 2 years. Last year, I'm driving from Dallas to Waco to speak at Baylor, and stop on the way, roadside barbecue joint, right? Muslim, don't eat pork. Good luck, right? So I'm like, all right, I'm like there. I mean, it's like, I will just repeat. Road from Dallas to Waco, roadside barbecue joint, closer to Waco than Dallas. Okay. I'm like, I'm gonna have the chicken and the cornbread, and she's like, sides? And I'm like looking for like pieces of pig and like, right? And she looks at me and she says, you can have this and this. And I looked at her, and I'm like, thank you. And she looked at me and she's like, everybody got to eat, right? But this is a beautiful moment, right? I mean, honestly, I'm a touch scared to say I don't eat pork, because what might that signal? She figures it out because of what I order and how I'm looking. And she protects me. You can eat this and this, right? And I look at her, I give her this knowing look, no words, just this kind of thank you look. And she's like, everybody's got to eat. Like, you know what she was like? She's like, I don't agree with you people, is what she's saying, but I'm going to feed you. What a beautiful thing. What a beautiful thing, right? So like I'm like looking for those moments. I collect those moments, right? Now, if I disagree with you on 99.9% of things, I'm going to look for the 0.01% where we can connect, and I'm going to start there. That is who I am, right? Not everybody has to be like that, right? Some of my staff is like, 50% maybe, right? This Eboo is 99%. Well, I'm not sure, right? I am not saying everybody's got to be like that, but if you are going to do interfaith work, the definition of it is you are leaning into difference or leaning into diversity, and diversity is not just the differences you like. I'm going to say that again, right? Diversity is not just the differences you like. So if I don't expect to run across, on occasion, somebody for whom I might have a difference that I don't really like, again, within the circle that's like a click narrower than the KKK bake sale, I'm not doing diversity work well. I'm basically running with people with whom I have a bunch of things in common, which is great, but it's not diversity work. I want to do 1 or 2 more questions. I'd love a question from a student. I'm not sure if you were a student. You might be a student. You're a student? Great. More questions from students. Yes. Yeah, what a great question, man. What's your name? Jaquay. We met earlier. Yeah, I shook your hand. I'm like, this is an insightful young man. See, I was right. Thank you for that question. So, it's funny. Thank you for asking that. I'll tell you this story. So I get to Oxford. I win this fancy scholarship called the Rhodes Scholarship. And I get there, and I'm scared out of my mind. And like we go to this restaurant this first night, all the American Rhodes Scholars. I've never met anybody in my life who's been to Oxford, okay? I grew up, I'm a smart guy. I grew up middle class in the western suburbs of Chicago, immigrant family. I went to the University of Illinois. I did really well, blah, 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 blah. But I'm not like, we didn't vacation on Martha's Vineyard. Let me put it that way, okay? So we go to like this restaurant, and like all these cats from Harvard and Princeton, they know a bunch of people. And I'm like, but how do you know people at Oxford? I mean, it's a different country and all, right? Well, it turns out that a bunch of people who graduate from Harvard and Princeton, they don't win a Rhodes, they're like 10 other scholarships at those universities that send them to Oxford, and they don't get one of those scholarships, they figure out a way to pay for it. So I don't come from that world. Again, I grew up perfectly comfortable, right? But I don't come from that world. So I'm like, all right, I'm different than you all, okay? We go to the first event at Rhodes House. Lady Kenny, they have titles there. Lady Kenny. It's not her first name, it's her title. It took me a week to figure that out, I'm not kidding, right? She shakes my hand. There's Rhodes Scholars from all over the world, so, South African accents and German accents, whatever. Shakes my hand. And she's like, oh, American. I'm like, yes. And she's like, Bill Clinton, charming man. Have you met him? I'm like, my parents own Subway sandwich stores in Lisle, Illinois. The hell, we're talking about meet Bill Clinton, right? But other people, it was a perfectly natural thing to say. I'm going to keep telling you stories because this is it's like therapy for me a little bit. So we have a book group going, and people keep on referring to this academic discipline called political philosophy. So I've heard of political philosophy. I knew that Voltaire was a political philosopher, and Thomas Jefferson was a political philosopher. James Madison was a political. I thought that after they all died, that was it. I had no idea that it had continued, this, right? But I'm listening, and they keep on talking about political, and talking about people like Michael Sandel and, Amy Gutman, and I'm like, I'm going to get these people's books, So I get their books, and honestly, I'm the state school kid who's like, oh, shoot. I have years of reading to catch up on, right? So I'm sneaking Michael Sandel, in my dorm room at night. And I go to the next book club, circle night or whatever. And somebody's like, when Professor Sandel and I were walking in Harvard Yard, I'm like, what the hell? You met this, he's alive, right? I'm like, okay, so you took a class. I didn't even know the discipline existed. Then you told me the guy was around, and I read his books, but now he's alive, and you took a walk with him, right? So I'm like, and they would all walk around with the New Yorker. I'd never seen a New Yorker. I didn't even know the New Yorker existed. I used to read the Tribune, right? Start with the sports pages. So I get New Yorkers, and I would sit in my dorm room, and I would look at the cover, and I'd be like, I am the dumbest Rhodes Scholar in the history of Rhodes. I can't figure out the damn cover, right? I'm like, what does this mean? I'm like, all these other Rhodes Scholars reading this thing in Latin, and I can't even decipher the cover. What does it mean that there's a dog, and the dog is walking the cat? What the hell does this mean, right? So it was just very discombobulating for me, right? And, it took me, and then, so, I'm going to just lie down and take my shoes off, get a cup of tea. I have about 52 minutes left. I know I owe $110 an hour. I know how this works. I'm going to tell one more story, right? So then, this is 3 or 4 months in, okay? By the way, this is not a joke. It gets dark in Oxford between October and April at 3:30 to 4 p.m. That is not a joke, okay? But actually, the sun doesn't come out for 6 months, so it's just dark all the time. I am not, go look it up. I am not, it is actually a wonderful time to do Ramadan, because it's like the fast is 8 to 3:30 and then it's done, you know? But outside of that, so it is just a really depressing place, right? So by November, like I am telling myself a story of I am the middle-class brown kid state schooler oppressed at Oxford. Like I'm telling myself this story. And then I make the mistake of telling it to my dad. And my dad is like, there are 320 million people in America and 32 Rhodes Scholars. You're oppressed? Are you, go make the most of a lifetime opportunity that God decided to drop on you. Right? And like literally, I had a decision to make. Am I going to feel bad about being a middle-class state school brown kid amidst like, you know, people who are fifth generation Princeton? Or am I going to be like, all right, I've never heard of Michael Sandel, time to read. All right, never heard of Amy Gutman, time to read. Right, I got work to do. What a blessing, alhamdulillah, I got work to do. Right, I get to catch up. Right, I get to like learn all of this. I would rather not be the guy who had never heard of Michael Sandel than be the guy who heard of him and have catching up to do. Great, let's go. Right, and I shifted. You know, I shifted, and it was a beautiful thing. I mean, I still have like very much a middle class immigrant son, western suburbs of Chicago, brown kid chip on my shoulder. Honestly, it's why it's why I wound up starting an organization and building this thing, et cetera, et cetera. People are like, you know, man, you must have a chip on your shoulder. Hell yeah, I have a chip on my shoulder, you know? And I think that combination of like Rhodes Scholar luck and middle-class immigrant upbringing, you know, honestly, like, I heard Hamilton, and I'm like, oh man, I understand, right? Like I get it, right? I get walking up to Aaron Burr and battling, right? I get being like, oh, you graduated Princeton in 3 years? I'm gonna graduate Princeton in 3 years. You know, that's who built this country. That's why we're America. I'm gonna drop there. That's just a mic drop. I'm done.